Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another installment of Discussions with a Theist on the Atheist Reformation YouTube channel. Joining me this afternoon is Deacon Joseph Suaiden of the Orthodox Apologetics channel, and he has also been a contributor on the Reason and Theology channel, which is where I actually first encountered him. How are you doing this evening?
I'm great. I'm a little bit tired, but I figured I'd noticed you had a channel. I figured I'd reach out to you because it was kind of fun talking to you that time we were on the debate about Fatima. So I was like, hey, let's
Yeah,
see
no,
what's going on.
I'm always happy to talk to people, win, lose, draw, indifferent, whatever branch of theology or non-theology they're from. I'm just happy to talk to people. For me, it's about the discussion more than anything else.
Well, that's good, and it's good that you're all. It's kind of like at least it's a learning experience, and that's really what it all comes down to is how
Exactly.
much more we can learn over time. Um, But in any case, yeah. So I mean, there were a few different things that we could talk about, but it's your show, so I'll follow your lead on this.
Well, in all honesty, the way I run this particular show is a little bit different. Like for instance, last night, if you tuned into my my pilot episode of Discussions with a Theist, it was with Elijah from Reason
Uh,
and Theology. I
yeah,
actually let him pick the topic because it was designed to be something that he was knowledgeable of, that he felt comfortable carrying on a conversation about, and then kind of progressing from there and just kind of seeing where it takes us. Because if you saw, we start with miracles and with a few key examples of what he presented as miracles, and then it just kind of diverged into this, what I felt was honestly a wonderful conversation. And so that's kind of what I look for in something like this. Start from a period of generally in large part some ignorance on my side of things, and then I try to see, okay, is there middle ground between these two viewpoints? If there is, what is it, and does it make sense? Is it rational? Is it logical? Does it serve a purpose? Does it benefit anybody? And if there is no middle ground, there's just there's just only these two ways about it, and no compromise is attainable. Well, why is that? And see if there's a way to reconcile that. That's
that's
generally
a
my aim.
that's a very good question. It's a very good point. It's a great idea. I was actually asking myself this earlier in the show, before the show, because of the fact that what I was trying to figure out was like, for example, in general, I'm an Orthodox deacon, an Orthodox Christian, and we don't generally we don't talk much to atheists, and I understand. I mean, if you know the history of the 20th century, militant atheism and communism kind of made people not want to talk about it at all because, frankly, you know, the whole thing killed a lot of Orthodox. So, but that's
True,
not,
true,
but you're
and
not
in
Stalin,
some
and so
right, and also under Stalin, you saw the establishment of Russian Orthodoxy as essentially just another arm of the state,
yeah.
and so that left a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. In all honesty, both theistic and atheistic alike.
Oh, and then don't get me wrong. I mean, my icon, Saint Joseph of Petrograd. He was the leader of the Catacomb Church, which was a movement against the church becoming an arm of the state. And
Okay,
he's considered widely, martyred by Rocor, by many throughout the world. But he is not officially glorified by the Patriarchate because of the political meaning it has.
okay.
So, so that totally, I get that. But yeah, no, I mean, I saw a lot. Everyone, communism made everyone hate it eventually. So the point is, and
Pardon me.
I can, yeah, so I can see that. I think, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Orthodoxy in general tends to focus on experience, and so this kind of is where you're going to find people butting heads because frankly, what you see as miraculous or don't see as miraculous, and I see as miraculous, the difference of experience can cause um, that butting of heads you were talking about.
Right. And to me, that would kind of create a bit of a rift, especially when talking to uh, not even what would be considered a strong atheist, those who just assert an express an express positive belief that no God exists, but more a rift with people, say, like me, who are, for lack of a better term, more on the agnostic side of things.
Yeah.
We look at the knowledge claims overall. And so for us, people like me say an argument from experience, or an argument ad populum, or even an argument from aesthetic experience, it just doesn't work for someone like me, because we're someone like me. I'm data driven. I'm information driven more than anything else, and for me, for something to be rational for myself to hold, I have to be able to measure that against reality, what I see as reality, what I can identify as real. Now,
I
granted, that
understand.
does leave things open to being for subjective interpretation, and I acknowledge that. But the best way I can describe my overall goal would be to quote Matt Dillahunty on this, and it's that I want my internal model of reality to, as best as possible, match reality.
Okay. Um, See now, what I would say to, and I'm gonna posit say, I'm gonna posit a early church martyr who is not a saint
Okay.
in Orthodoxy, Tertullian, and what he once said in response to a question about his belief was in Latin, "Credo quia absurdum est," or "I believe because it is absurd." And what I mean by that is that if as an Orthodox Christian, I believe in an all-powerful and ever-living God who also decided to come to Earth, die, come back, I'm already accepting that reality in some way, shape, or form is fundamentally warped than how it works normally.
Okay.
So it's where there's a point, only so far logic can get you before things start to break down. And this is true in basically almost anything we can think of. It makes sense until it doesn't, and that's kind of my point with it. So I'm not against using, say, for example, the discussion of philosophy. Like when I was a Roman Catholic 20 years ago,
Hmm.
24, 23 years ago, wow, how time flies. Um, Everything could be explained through logic. God could be explained through. There was a theorem that could explain God. Now I realize that there are holes in each of these now, and I
Right.
did many years ago as well. You can only go so far with them. I can go so far. You can use, say for example, the argument from the design, but this proves nothing about the designer. You can use the argument from first principle, but that doesn't prove what the first principle is. And so the point is, I
Well,
can,
true. If you'll allow me to interject here for
yeah,
just a moment,
please,
um, for me, one of the largest things I see coming from really any theistic background, particularly Christian, this tends to be more common with Roman Catholicism, but these are arguments that I encounter across the board for the most part. Now, I will admit I do not have anywhere near as much exposure uh, to Orthodox Christianity or Eastern Orthodoxy, anything of that sort, purely by the fault of I live in Deep East Texas. There really isn't an Orthodox community in this area. It's the
okay,
same reason I haven't had many interactions with, say, Hasidic Jews. They just don't live in this area. So I don't get that opportunity as often as I would like. Um, that being said, some of the more common arguments that I come across are some of the old arguments from Thomas Aquinas, the five ways, the unmoved mover,
yeah,
things like that nature, or the first mover, prime mover, things like that. And I don't what I guess it's either a failure in my understanding or a breakdown in communication that personally I think is the issue. Is that I can look at what's being discussed and I can recognize it for what it is. It's a modification of Aristotelian thought,
yeah, that's
and
exactly what it is.
and
And
and that's entirely derived from, on a scientific standpoint, Aristotelian physics, which inherently relies upon celestial bodies not moving, remaining fixed, And that's where this uncaused cause hypothesis seems to derive from. But with what we know about cosmology and cosmogony nowadays, it's very obvious that celestial bodies indeed move, and they're moving all the time, constantly. And so
Sure.
it defeats the first notions of Aristotelian physics, and to me just kind of dismantles the whole argument because it's relying on a scientific principle that doesn't exist.
Well, I think that to some degree, this is precisely where, as much as we tend to think of Orthodoxy as static and being unchanging versus Roman Catholicism, this is really one of the points where I hate to say this, but after the schism, Roman Catholicism sort of goes backward. And what I mean by that is that the early church fathers did use Aristotelian categories, but they also stated that there's only so far you can get with any sort of secular philosophy, so we shouldn't over rely on it. But it's after the schism, with the rising of scholasticism, Thomas Aquinas, etc., that they literally bring back Aristotle even harder than before. And so that's where we suddenly got the answers to everything. It didn't matter if those answers were wrong. In many cases, they were based on forgeries. I mean, Thomas Aquinas himself, when he wrote his Errors Against the Greeks, literally 75% of the texts that he was relying on to prove his points were forged.
Really?
So, yeah. So the point is, if you're using bad text, and this is part of the reason why in Orthodox apologetics, and people kind of hate me for this, I'm very big about using the fathers. That is, that it's got to be the source. Because for us, the fathers, and this is one thing where I felt a little bit bad for William Albrecht, because you were correct in pointing out that the patristic period, as it's properly understood, ends with the Council of Nicaea. You can find that in a dictionary. His argument would have been that we can consider later saints and so on to be fathers. From an Orthodox standpoint,
it could just be, at least as far as my tendency to give just about everybody benefit of the doubt, it could just simply be that, speaking off the cuff, he spoke out of turn and didn't realize it and just kept going along the vein of thought that he had. That happens to me all the time.
Yeah, I would posit he was actually trying to use a counter that was actually something I could have anticipated, but your response was much more entertaining, and that was that he would have said basically later saints can still be considered fathers. That is the Orthodox position. It is not the Roman Catholic position, which does hold that the period of the Church Fathers ends with Saint John Damascene, in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So ironically, you were literally pointing out his own church's definition, and he was trying to use mine to defend his own people. Huh. So funny stuff there. But anyway,
the errors happen. That's just.
Yeah.
To err is human and all that fun stuff. And see, I guess, like I was saying, that's kind of where my hang-up would be in, say, if we were discussing the overall validity of a theology or religious practice, you and I could only go so far with it, and I think we would automatically disagree when it comes to the level of maybe some of the categories that we use, because as you pointed out just a moment ago, you go to the fathers, to the church fathers, to the source as what you describe it. Whereas for someone like me, okay, I can on the surface agree with you that this individual said that, and that at the very least justifies why someone would consider this to be doctrine of some sort.
Yeah.
But the doctrine of a religion really doesn't have any effect on, say, if you're trying to convert somebody, or
right.
if you're trying to have a discussion where you're trying to educate someone on the practices or the philosophy of your particular religious belief,
right.
and then bring that person into the fold to make a believer out of them or make them a believer again. And so you posted an interesting title idea in our Twitter feed, so I decided to run with this to an extent, and we can kind of use this discussion right here as my answer to your question of what's holding Drew back from joining the Orthodox Church.
Excellent. Okay. What's
Hey,
holding you back?
I try to bring a little bit of comedic levity to the situation from time to
I
time.
like. Well, I've actually used that with in most of my dialogues on the Apologetics channel with people who aren't Orthodox. I've actually started with "What's holding you back from joining the Orthodox Church?" So yeah, it's a that's. I mean, I wasn't going to do that now because I thought that was kind of intrusive. But hey, let's go with it.
No, I'm happy to cover that. Like I said, we're on my channel. Yes, this is a show that I envisioned and created. But the way I see things is when I have a guest on, the show is about that guest. That person is the main event. I'm just the fat schlub in Texas that's interviewing, discussing with, and trying to come up with some entertaining questions or thoughts with which to respond to what they're talking about. And also, my overall goal is, I think, like I believe I kind of espoused to you when we were discussing how to go about doing this today, and that was, I know that I am not a PhD in any of this stuff. My educational background when it comes to philosophy is almost nil. I'm majority self-educated on that. My educational background, more than anything, focuses on three things because I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up, and that is chemical and mechanical engineering, um, criminal justice, at least as far as the American system of criminal justice, and American political science. Those are my three areas of greatest education, and even then, I'm not degreed in any of that. So, I mean, if anybody wants to say, "Oh, he's saying something because he knows something," no, I'm an authority on nothing. This is my exploration of my thoughts, of my beliefs, of my intellectual withholdings to throw out in front of the entire world and say, "Hey, what do you think about it? Is it good? Is it crap? Is it in the middle? What is it?"
That's fair. I mean, I don't think that I personally am. I've never been of a school, and it may be my own particular experience, but I think that sometimes the degrees kind of hold us back. And I don't necessarily want to say that that's true. If you're talking about like particle physics or being a doctor, yeah, you really do need those degrees.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
but I tend to think that you have degrees and then you have degrees, and a lot of people hold this lower category of degrees, which how I refer to them, were basically they faked it till they made it. They tried to figure out what they were doing, and then they had to write a thesis, and their thesis was usually garbage, but it didn't matter because it still looked like a valid question and answer. It was still like it covered something. It proved that they sat in their seats for a long time, and unfortunately, in that sense, the academic system of peer review, for its advantages, can also carry serious disadvantages because of the cognitive biases of those reading them. It's how confirmation bias and errors that become widespread community. And this is one of the things I and Bishop Enoch on our show, we encounter this almost every week. There's long held this sort of random historical fact that turns out to just be based on nothing. It's based on opinions that are then codified into other people's opinions, that are then codified into other people's opinions, and all you had to do was look at the original manuscript, thousands of which are now available and visible online, and you can see, oh, that word really wasn't there. So the point is,
it's funny you bring that up because it actually reminds me, and the only reason it reminds me of my discussion with Elijah last night is purely because it happened last night, and so it's fresh in my mind. There's other examples I'm sure I could come up with, but this is just the most readily available, and that is when we were talking about the Tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and in particular the saint associated with it, Saint Juan Diego. And from a Catholic source, it appears, or at least from a Catholic author, when we looked at the HuffPost article, was that there's really not a lot of historical evidence, if really any, supporting that Juan Diego even existed. And one thing that was pointed out was the Codex Escalada. And when looking that up, at first I was thinking, okay, maybe this is like some kind of book talking about Juan Diego. At which point it's like, okay, hang on, we've got something to talk about here. And then come to find out it's It's a drawing on a piece of parchment that happens nearly 2 decades after the event supposedly occurred, and it's essentially an artist's rendition of the occurrence.
Interesting. Now, I'll be honest with you. I've learned new things all the time. I don't, obviously, we're not Roman Catholics, so we don't recognize the Lady of Guadalupe or anything. But the point is, that is a curious thing, because I did read a book once that apparently described even the presence of most Arabic bishops debating whether the image was canonical or not. So, I mean, I don't know that if this is, it would be interesting though if they were all arguing about a picture someone drew based on the description. And if that's the case, well, if that's the case, that throws everything away. It was like taking Fatima apart. If that's the case, then this could all just be a case of some ridiculous artist gone amok wanting to get some level of fame. Who knows? I mean, it's sad, but.
And it's like I was telling Elijah the other day, or yesterday, and he agreed to this, and I was actually, I'm not going to say I was surprised at it. It was to some degree expected, and not negatively expected. I found it rather impressive is that he agreed with me on the topic of, if we're talking about these incorruptible bodies, so to speak. And we know for a fact that there are multiple natural mechanisms by which these phenomena can occur. Would it not then be reasonable to make the assumption at the onset when something like this is found that there is more likely than not a natural explanation for why this occurred versus a supernatural explanation? At least until we've exhausted the possibilities of the natural.
I agree with you. I think that to a large degree, we're supposed to be skeptical. And this is one of the reasons, I'm not just saying it to be disagreeable because, Roman Catholics tend to be overly credulous. As I mentioned, the bishop who died that was involved in cancer healings. He's still not a saint in our church because we're still not sure what happened. But there's a lot more support for it now, including from me, because that's tangible. At least you can talk to people, see what could have caused this, etc. Still not total proof, but it brings you a step closer. But absolutely, I mean, there were saints that were put in the calendar that were dropped off because the passage of time made people realize, those weren't saints after all, and so they just vanished.
Right. So Elijah actually is watching the show. So hi, Elijah. Thanks for tuning in, man. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad you came on the show last night, and I really do look forward to the next time you come on. And hopefully after this evening, Deacon, you'd be willing to come back on and talk to me again. I think it'd be rather entertaining more than anything else, and hopefully informative. So Elijah says scientists looked at it, talking about the tilma of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and concluded that an artist could not have painted it. That's fine. That's okay. I'm not talking about the canvas itself in that regard. It was more the assertion of the existence of Juan Diego. That's what I was bringing up. I have not had a chance to watch that documentary that you sent me a link for, Elijah, but I promise you I will watch it as soon as I possibly can. So keep that in mind. And Elijah says hi back. So.
Okay, well, he was more saying that to me, I guess.
Yeah,
okay.
He does actually. He did actually. He does more so saying that to Deacon.
Well, the issue becomes if it wasn't painted, then how was it produced? I mean, the simple reality is, if we're talking about the Shroud of Turin, for example, I know that you mentioned that last night. You can clearly see that was created by burning. You can figure out a process. You can't simply say scientists looked at it and concluded an artist couldn't have painted it. They would have concluded that something did paint it or did something. You can't just say, well, scientists were like, don't know what this is. That's not how science works. So my guess,
right, and some other things that I found on that, talking about the tilma specifically, was that over the years, the parts of the image that were skin tone appeared to darken with exposure. So that lends credence to the possibility that if this was something dyed on the cloth, then there were UV reactive dyes even during that time. They just didn't know that it was reacting to ultraviolet light. And also there's been I think even dating back to uh, in early India, early Hinduism, there were methods of not necessarily painting, but they would crush up gemstones to use to dye certain cloths and things like that.
Okay. Well, okay. Now, Elijah wrote Deacon. I recommend you look into it before making a conclusion. I'm not
Right,
that
and I would
curious.
say the same thing for
Yeah.
anybody.
I mean, I wasn't like trying to put down your Our Lady there of Guadalupe. I don't care enough to do that, and it's not to be rude. It's just that, to be quite frank, if I don't believe and I don't think that there's evidence that Elijah's church is real, why am I going to take things that supposedly prove the existence? I know the Theotokos exists. I don't need a proof of that. I don't have, if there's no proof of Juan Diego, okay, to me it's an interesting picture. It's not a canonically correct icon, so I'm not sure what to think of it.
Okay.
There were statements to the effect that people thought, and some many do still think, that it was some sort of mother goddess picture, and so I've heard that argument too.
Right.
The point I'm trying to make is that it doesn't make sense to me to not be skeptical of the process. I'm always skeptical of the process,
Okay.
including in my church, and we're supposed to be. That's my point. Is that this is one of the things that drove me nuts about the Fatima thing, is because so it lacks so much in terms of what I think of when I think of miraculous, and there's more hype than reality.
Keeping in the vein of thought on miracles and kind of, to some extent, kind of intentionally steering away from the well, not necessarily dissimilarities, but
the difference,
the differences of opinion and the differences of doctrine
sure,
between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, and that's just purely because I'm not a Catholic, and the Catholic sitting in the comment section, and so that's what reason and theology does. I don't want to try and step on what they tend to do. So just more kind of, out of respect for them, because they helped me kind of get started too. So, I try to be respectful, at least as far as that goes.
yeah.
But talking about miracles to a certain extent, so what would be the Orthodox take on some kind of miraculous occurrence? What would something like that take? You just said that even the instance of the Our Lady of Fatima miracle, as described by RC, is that it doesn't meet your criteria. It
No,
doesn't go far enough. That there are things that are lacking. So,
right.
what would qualify as a miraculous occurrence to an Orthodox?
Yeah. Well, okay. There's one, like you mentioned, incorruptibility. I don't know how far you got with that. Incorruptibility can be part of it, but usually it's incorruptibility along with something else. Say, for example, when I was in Greece, I saw the tomb of Saint John the Russian. The body gushes myrrh, massive amounts of myrrh, to the point where there's actually a small well that collects it. And you can literally see the body. It's in a glass container. It just sits there, and there's just oil coming out and stuff like that. And so I have some of that oil. I took that with me. This also happens at the tomb of, I believe it happens at the tomb of St. John of Shanghai in San Francisco. This is not, and this happens with many icons. There are many myrrh-bearing icons. A lot of the time they're crying icons. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
People get way too happy about it when generally history has shown us that those are usually signs that something bad's going to occur. But in any case, the point is you can see something is not normal. You can pick up the icon, turn it around. You can see where is it coming from. Nobody knows. But the point is, at least that has some. You can touch it. You're allowed to kiss it. You're allowed to touch it. So on and so forth. And we found frauds. There was a famous kid. My first experience with a crying icon was in Queens. I was 9 years old. I was Roman Catholic. My mother was like, "Oh, I saw this on the news. We have to go." It was exposed as a fraud 2 years later. But then there are the ones that aren't, and those are the ones that we require answers to. So that's where a miracle for us is God manifesting himself directly in a way that's very difficult to work with. It does not follow rules and procedures of life, if that makes sense.
Okay. So, one thing I have a question about when it comes to like the Murberry icons, where you talk about the in Greece how the oil seems to come from the body and whatnot, and it's collected. You said you have a vial of it.
Yeah.
Uh, to me, that's rather interesting. And one thing that I would probably ask is, has there ever been any allowed investigation to see if there may or may not be some mechanism by which oil is being pumped into and then subsequently allowed to flow out of this glass case?
Oh, no, of course, and that happens all the time. That's exactly my point. Is that with especially with the Tomb of Saint John the Russian, I would assume that they did their own investigations on it. With icons, I've actually seen that where people have actually been shown the icon still screaming, the myrrh still coming out of it. They take it out of a case. There's no connections to a tube, and that's how frauds are usually discovered. Well, usually when someone has made some little contraption where oil is coming out and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the ones that I guess are, for lack of a better word, impressive or miraculous are the ones that have been checked, have been tested, and are still shooting oil. So,
Right, and I guess something that again, we're kind of getting into my analytical mindset. We're kind of dipping back toward, my chemical and mechanical engineering background, primarily
yeah,
the chemical side of things. And just to address one last thing from Elijah, he said he didn't want to take over the conversation. You didn't, man. I'm just thoroughly appreciative that you're tuning in, and hey, any support is always more than welcome. Um, and that would be when we're talking about myrrh oil. Um, with it being a terpene like oil, myrrh should be able to congeal since it is a derivative of a tree resin, right?
yeah.
So, as with all things that congeal, especially from an oil base, what it takes to, pardon me, make them return to their more liquid state would simply be an application of heat, a change in temperature. And you can take myrrh in its congealed form, pick it up and put it in your hand and hold it between your fingers, and it'll melt back into oil rather quickly. So what's to say that say you have these crying icons? There really wouldn't be much of a way to test specifically whether or not someone say applied a slight congealed amount of myrrh to the eyes of the icon, which then later heat up as the service continues on and then begins to flow.
Well, I mean that would be one of the most obvious tests would be to simply watch it on camera because eventually it will run out of myrrh. Yeah, I mean that we're talking when you're talking about bottles and bottles worth coming out every day. Somebody has to be applying the myrrh. There has to be
Right.
some sort of the fraud has to have a physical foundation. But when
Exactly.
it doesn't, and you've got this, you're watching this thing 8 hours, 10 hours a day, and it's still just leaking out myrrh. Something
Mm-hmm.
else is going on.
Okay, I can see where you're saying on that one. And now on some of these,
And
um,
I will say by the way, that myrrh that I have, the oil that I have, it has congealed in winter. The one that I have myself, it's turned white. I've moved it to another room, and it just turns to liquid.
right, and I'm willing to bet that in just a few minutes, depending on the amount and the consistency of it, you could probably just cup your hands around that vial and just hold it for a few minutes, and then it would return to a liquid state rather quickly.
Yeah, well, I didn't do that, but I just put it in another room, and it was liquid within a few minutes. Anyway.
Oh, well, see, there you go. Pardon me. Still coming down after having some chest congestion and whatnot, so have to bear with some coughs every once in a while.
No
Been
problem.
eating cough drops like candy the last couple of days.
I could use a cough drop. Anyway, yeah, so that's I guess that's kind of the way I would look at it. So it's kind of weird because yeah, I understand the limits of data, but at the same time, I also have to take into account when something doesn't make sense according to reality. What do you do with it? And that's kind of the uncomfortable line I live in.
Right, and I think that may be part of where some criticism comes from is that at least from what little I've been able to actually research about orthodoxy and Orthodox apologetics is one thing that I see as I'm not going to say necessarily a common occurrence or even an accusation, more just a common topic of discussion is that when speaking to someone or trying to debate someone about something, say to even this effect, you talk about having that blurred line of being data driven and then spiritually driven as far as that goes. And mostly it comes down to a person generally saying that it's difficult to speak to someone such as yourself purely because they're not sure which side of the line you're standing on at a given point of time.
I think that's a fair statement. But I mean, I don't know about Orthodox apologists in general, but at least for me, I'm saying, yeah.
That would be a misstep on my part saying Orthodox apologetics. Just conversations with Orthodox proponents in general.
Okay.
Would have been more appropriate for me to say.
Well,
because I haven't seen much in the way of Orthodox apologetics personally.
Well, yeah, to be quite honest, we're a small bunch, and a lot of people don't like us. So, but we do our job as best we can. But the methodology that I employ, which is just the use of the church fathers, is the way it was always done. And that's a line I can draw back to Overback in the 19th, 20th century, to St. Mark of Ephesus in the 15th century, even to St. Photius, and eventually gets to Saints Martin and Maximus, all the way back to St. Justin Martyr. So for us, that's the biggest, I guess, proof of our, I guess you could say, our understanding of reality is that we always have to draw that line that goes back to the apostles. So the liturgy that we use, whether it's our Western Rite liturgy, which we believe was descended from St. Peter, or the usual Eastern Orthodox liturgy, which is the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is actually a shortening of the liturgy of St. Basil because the people couldn't take it because it was too long, which is actually a shortening of the liturgy of St. James, which they stopped because the people couldn't take it because it was too long. Mm-hmm. They brought back the liturgy of St. James, and it's like once a year because I think that's all they're doing.
So with looking at it from that perspective, having to draw that line for yourself in your own religious studies and explorations towards greater spiritual, philosophical, realistic understanding, however you choose to word that, a question that comes to mind is such as a conversation with someone like me, where things like that hold no weight. How would that conversation be handled at that point? Assuming that it's non-combative, just like our conversation is now, but say venturing more towards not necessarily an organized debate, but more of we've reached the point where there is this disconnect in how we view reality and how we view different ideals and beliefs. How do we get past that point, or what is the, I'm not going to say standard tactic because it makes it sound insidious when I'm not trying to make it that, but what would be the approach typically taken to try and not necessarily end run around it, but try to break that barrier down to start a deeper conversation?
I guess the question would be like, if we go back to the original question, what's holding you back from becoming Orthodox? And my first question would become, well, what?
Wait, hang on. I want to bring that banner back up. There we go.
All right,
so we're into that segment now.
All right. So here's my question to you: how do you understand? What do you know about Jesus Christ?
Well, you might find me a little bit tough to deal with on that one. In
Sure.
That based on what little I've been able to actually study about the whole thing as a whole, I actually tend towards the mythicist camp of those such as Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Price.
So you think Jesus wasn't real?
I'm of the mind that it's at least likely as not that he wasn't real. So I would say at this point, if I were to put odds on it, so to speak, I would say it's about 50-50.
You see, this is part of where we may be in a bit of a disagreement, because if I'm saying that I'm part of the Church of Jesus Christ that was founded by his apostles, and you're saying he's not even real, we're gonna have some disagreements. Now, granted, one can argue a lack of the body, but one cannot argue a lack of the body for the apostles. I know they're real. We have their bones. So they could have, now in theory, you're right, they could have just decided to all collectively commit suicide for somebody who wasn't real. Uh, but the likelihood is most people don't go and commit a gigantic mass suicide and organize future suicides for the next 300 years over somebody they thought was an interesting idea.
No, but we do see evidence of that in other what will be described as cult-like behavior. Now, cult today, the word cult has a very negative
Yeah,
and bad connotation. But when I use cult, I'm kind of trying to bridge that gap a little bit.
you're
In
referring to
that,
cultists, basically.
you say what?
You're referring to the more proper and traditional use of cultists, not the modern use of cultists.
Correct. And so, in that regard, modern cultists, not to use the negative connotation of the word,
Yeah.
but they had those sincerely held beliefs, such as the Jonestown incident, where you have this mass suicide of a very large number of people because they believed that something was coming to save them. Or I think it was Heaven's Gate. I want to say
Yeah, I
it was.
remember Heaven's Gate. Yep. That
Right.
was
So you had the Heaven's Gate situation, and even going on into the Waco situation with the Branch Davidians.
mhm.
I mean, so these are religious organizations. These are, um, to some degree, cults in the traditional sense that have attained a level of ingrainment in their beliefs that they quite literally chose to take on the world and die for it.
Yeah.
Now, granted, it didn't take place over the course of 3 centuries, but at the same time, the the counter I would levy to that would simply be one of population density. It just would take longer almost a couple of thousand years ago because there are just far fewer people spread out over just as large of an area. Whereas in those 3 instances, one of them was entirely self-inflicted, and uh, another one, specifically the Branch Davidian incident, was where they literally took on an entire law enforcement agency on national news.
Sure.
So, a large
I,
number of people in a small area.
okay. Now, here's what I would counter that if we're going to, once again, if we're going to use the witness of these people, because I think that we have to discount them entirely in order to validate the argument that they'd be in some way similar to the Branch Davidians, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
is that they held to a moral code which was very strict in comparison to the Greco-Roman world in which they were being persecuted at first, martyred, and then actually took over. But the point is, more importantly, from the Apostolic Fathers, you can clearly see that these are people who are referencing that their teachers spoke directly with Christ. Not in a spiritual sense, but that they literally walked with the Lord, because the Apostolic Fathers were made by the apostles themselves. So I don't think that we can hold to this idea that early Christianity was one where people, unless we start mixing in Gnosticism with everything, which is not how we do things.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, unless we argue that the church fathers were liars, because they'd have to be ultimately. Because if you're saying that this apostle walked with Jesus Christ and was there at his crucifixion, it's really hard to read into that. But he was probably talking about an imaginary person. um, it's not a great inference I would take from it. So
Right.
I don't think
Well, I would say at that point, one of the things that would need to be discussed is yes, essentially we would be calling these individuals liars for sure, and I get that and I accept that, um, and that does create a very large bone of contention with a lot of people, obviously, because at that point I'm sitting there and telling someone that I look at the situation as a whole, and with the evidence that I have available, determine that it seems at least likely as not that all these individuals were simply lying or mistaken about something, or in some ways, there's even been assertions that some of the apostles themselves may not even have existed.
And how do
I
we have their
mean,
bones?
I'm sorry.
Well, we have the bones of the apostles. And
Well, here's the thing though.
okay, go ahead.
We have bones. Sure,
Okay.
we have bones,
Mhm.
but we have no way, especially now, of actually verifying who those bones belong to. Not with any degree of certainty that would, say, satisfy even a baseline scientific experiment. Now, could we do DNA testing on these bones
Sure.
and determine where this person was from, around what time they lived, and we could possibly even go so far as to, depending on the quality of the preservation of the corpse, would be to determine everything down to maybe not necessarily the diet, but potentially their overall station, their socioeconomic class, based on the level of nutrition we see within their body or their bones.
Now, I have an interesting question for you because this has
Okay.
to I have to ask this because we live in the age of the internet. And of course, the most common response to that is Lincoln real. And what I mean by that is that eventually we have to get to a point where we go from knowing to not knowing, from certainty to uncertainty. Because in many cases, the relics of the saints had inscriptions that can
Mm-hmm.
be dated back, to the first and second centuries. And it would be difficult to say, but that's not. I mean, eventually, where do we say, okay, that looks like it's probably real, but it's probably not? Like, do you see what I'm getting at?
Right, and so to go along with that vein of thought and talk about certainty for a little bit, as far as that goes, is I don't believe that we can be truly certain of anything. I don't. I accept degrees of certainty based on to what level of evidence do I have to support either what it is I'm saying or what it is someone else is saying, for me to accept that either as fact, a well-formed hypothesis, a good question, or just simply conjecture. Pardon me for a second.
No problem.
No, had to get that cough out. And so, there are some things to which I would say I have a maximal degree of certainty, to kind of pull in some more from Matt Dillahunty a little bit, because it makes a good deal of sense, at least to me. And that is, I am as certain as I personally can possibly be about a couple of things.
Okay.
Like, for instance, a good example of that would just, there are two good examples. One of which would be something like gravity. I am maximally certain. I'm as certain as I can possibly be that if I were to put this in a vacuum chamber and measure its drop rate from a predetermined height, that it would measure up to the pull of gravity on this planet, which is 9.8 meters per second squared, and that would be its acceleration due to gravity. And the other thing that I would say I'm for sure maximally certain of, to as great a degree as I possibly can, is that I have two children. I mean, I was there through the whole process, so uh,
Okay. Well, I think that that's one of the I guess you would say this is where we get into the question of not just the who and the what, but the why. And
mhm.
what I mean by that is this: um, if we cannot establish a lot of things with certainty, let's just assume we can establish very little with absolute certainty, except that which we experience, which is
Okay.
where we get right back into it. Now, my question becomes: let's assume a null platform here. What do you know in terms of the concept of the story of Jesus Christ and why he came?
Let's say that one more time. It kind of cut out just a little bit.
Yes, placing against kind of a null background of what's you know what I guess you could say we're going to leave the question of knowledge versus lack of knowledge or lack of certainty.
Okay.
What's your understanding of Christ?
My understanding of Christ is pretty much the baseline understanding that I think most people have, especially, say, coming from a theistic background like what I did, and that is
What background did you come from?
a combination of Baptist, Methodist, and Roman Catholic.
Wow. Okay. The big three. Go
We
ahead.
moved around a lot when I was younger.
All right.
Um, so my understanding of Jesus comes from, I guess, kind of an amalgamation of all three of those. He was born of a virgin, raised up, gathered disciples, taught, performed miracles, was persecuted, beaten, and crucified. After which point he was entombed for 3 days, supposedly rose from the dead, appeared before several people. Paul had his Damascus Road experience, and and I think that actually happens after that. So
Yeah,
forgive me for getting a little bit of the details
no. You're
out of order.
you're doing good. You're doing great.
And bodily ascended into heaven.
Yeah.
At which point he awaits his second coming and the kickoff of Armageddon, essentially.
Okay, so basically, so from your perspective, and I'm not, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I to understand, Jesus basically, he came, he died, he shot back up, he's kind of sitting there waiting for everything to go down and the four horsemen and all the fun stuff, right?
Essentially, yeah.
I would say that understanding is fundamentally different than the way we understood Christ. And what I mean by that is, for us, Christ is not far away. And they tend to think in terms of, as Americans, and you mentioned, Methodists and Baptists, they talk about the personal experience of Jesus, so on and so forth, but it's really a mental experience. It is not, it's not it feels personal because it's emotional, sure, but that's not what I'm referring to when I say the personal experience of Jesus. What I'm referring to, and this is what Christ himself, I'm sure you remember in the gospel, it talks about, with the faith of the grain of a mustard seed, you can move mountains.
Right.
My view is that essentially, I would say it's the church's view, is that essentially Christ gave to his holy apostles the full power and wisdom and knowledge of himself. As weird as that sounds.
So let me stop you there for just a brief moment. I want to make sure I'm tracking with you and that I'm on the same page.
Yeah.
So to me, that sounds like you're describing as if Jesus imbued some of his divine nature into the 12 apostles.
Into the collective, yes, and the believers, the church as a whole, the assembly. So it is not and that's part of the reason why we have to draw that line, because it's not simply just people just tapping each other, going, "Okay, you're next." I hate to say this. Have you ever seen the movie Demon Knight in Tales from the Crypt?
It's been several years, but yes, I believe I have.
It's cheesy. It's 80s. It's B
of course,
movie.
It's Tales from the Crypt. I mean, that's what made it awesome, was the cheesiness.
But I view it as probably the best catechesis I've ever seen outside of maybe the Matrix movie. And what I mean by that is because the whole idea, the whole point of the Demon Knight, is just to refresh your memory, and for those who don't want to have to watch a B movie for 2 hours, is basically Will Smith's wife, Sarah Jada Pinkett. I guess she plays some, I forget, she's just a Roman person, and she meets some other Roman guy in this little town. Mm-hmm. And from this little town, it turns out that the guy that she meets is actually basically known as the Demon Knight. And his job is to basically stop Satan from killing off everyone. And of course, Satan shows up that night to kill him off. And it turns out that he's part of a long line of people, and this goes all the way back to the crucifixion, who are just putting their blood into this little flask. And that flask then becomes imbued with the power to block demons by dropping little drops of it, and it flows off things. Mm-hmm. And so the point is, at the end of the movie, he dies and she becomes the next demon. And so
it screams of old school Rosicrucianism.
Maybe I'm not a big Rosicrucian, but the point is,
Well, as far as like the thought, I may be using the wrong term there, but the following of the blood of the blood of Jesus Christ is that there is some kind of spiritual familial connection that has come down through the ages, through the literal, essentially transfusion of the blood of Christ from one person to the next, on down through the ages.
Well, that expression that sounds very accurate for the movie, but in some ways it expresses a reality that we experience in the church. Because
Okay.
when we do the sacred rites, and our ministers are given that power from the successors of the apostles, we really believe the body and blood of Christ are there. And what I mean by that is not in an academic sense, like, okay, well, that's the body and blood of Christ. What I mean is you're literally in that spot once again. That the bread and wine, the body and blood, are the same as they were at the Last Supper 2,000 years ago. You're in the same place.
So it seems as though it's almost, for lack of a better term, and this is not to be dismissive, but more to help rationalize it for someone who may not quite understand the precise point you're arriving at. It seems as though it's an almost trans-dimensional version of transubstantiation.
I mean, I say transdimensional. We have to say transdimensional in the sense of essence and energies, because God is unapproachable in his essence, but he is visible and approachable in his energies.
Mm-hmm.
But so it is transdimensional in that sense, and it does transcend time. I really hope you get better with that cough rate.
Oh, I'm oddly enough, this is me on the mend. Oddly enough, it's gotten to the point of where it's just a dry cough with some allergy congestion, because now all the pollen's coming in. So I'm kind of getting hit from both sides at this point. So, it is what it is.
Well, I hope
but I do appreciate the sentiment.
Yeah. For your healing, I hope. Just get better. Can you give me 1 second?
Sure, take your time.
Okay. Anyway, so I'm back. Sorry about that. But
no problem at all.
Yeah. So in that sense, yes, it is. I even get nervous about using the term transubstantiation, because that tends toward people thinking in terms of it being a form of Catholicism.
And that's why I was saying I was using those terms not necessarily to be dismissive or to like lump you in with just the whole runaround of transubstantiation, but more as a rationalistic tool.
You know what the word is? You'll find it in many Orthodox texts. Transmutation.
Transmutation. Okay. Gosh. That's where my inner nerd comes out, because I remember studying the life of Sir Isaac Newton, and how after he kind of became born again and became an accountant, how he got into alchemy and all this stuff, and obsessing with transmuting lead into gold and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, the alchemical understanding comes closest to the understanding of physical change, and so I guess. But even that's incomplete, because this is an action of the Holy Spirit, which is what we do. And so the point I'm trying to make is, in that sense, and this is what I've tried to explain. Like, if you look at and I can't find the quote directly, it's Saint Justin Martyr, and it was in one of his dialogues, him being the first apologist. And what he actually said was, Christians are few in number, but without us, the world will end. And what that means is effectively, it would be one thing if we just proactively let it be like Christ sitting up on the throne far away until apocalypse comes. But that's not our job. We have to bring, I guess you could say, the power of God to as many nations as we can. And so in that sense, we're kind of like guarding time itself. So it's not as simple as just going to church and being like, hey.
Right. It's more along the lines of how what we quantified, at least in Methodism, as the concept of onward Christian soldiers, so to speak.
One of the things that I find interesting about Methodism, and they're not, obviously they're not Orthodox, but they're they a lot of them followed, what was that other guy, Arminius?
I think so.
And Arminius, kind of tried to resolve the faith works paradigm, whereas for us, that in the West, that was faith versus works versus faith and works versus and for us it's just faith. Works just mean you're not doing evil, because you're either doing good works of good or you're doing works of evil. And so it's much simpler, but that leads into a whole bunch of other topics. But
right.
But the point is, so from my perspective, what I would try to offer you in terms of your holding, you holding that and joining the Orthodox Church, is once you understand that, I guess you would say, if Christ came down to mankind, we're just going to assume he's and he came down specifically to reestablish your link with God, lost at the beginning of creation. And I accept that this God is kind of, he's unknowable right now. So we're leaving this as a null proposition.
Okay.
If that was the purpose, would that be compelling enough to learn more from those who claim to be his church? And I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about we have a bishop in Texas. It's funny you mentioned that, Liberty Hill. I don't know where that is, because Texas is huge. But in any case, we have a case that lives on the other side of Texas, I think, too. But the point is that if the grace of God could transform not only your life itself, but transform the life of those around you in a way that I can explain for hours, would that be compelling enough to find out more about it?
Would it? So you're asking, would that be compelling enough?
To suddenly touch the creation of the creator of the universe.
Well, as far as that goes, in all honesty, I hate to kind of sound like a Matt Dillahunty clone.
No.
But to me, it makes a great deal of sense, this take on it, and it describes my thoughts on something like that more accurately than I probably could elucidate on my own. And that would be that what it would take for me to be compelled is, I honestly don't know what it would take to actually compel me to the acceptance of belief. I just know that as of right now, I have not encountered that yet.
This is good. This is actually good.
And so obviously I have not encountered that yet. I may have thought I have in the past, but I have not encountered what I would consider compelling yet. And what I would consider compelling, I don't know specifically what it would be. Just that if a deity exists, if it is the God of the Abrahamic religions, the God of the Bible, Orthodoxy, whichever denomination, excuse me, that deity, with it having the property of being omniscient, has essentially no choice but to know precisely what it would take to compel me.
That's correct.
And at that point, if at any point I am not compelled, to me that responsibility to some degree would fall on the deity for simply choosing to not provide that revelation, that compelling revelation.
I would argue that so long as one is open to that ability, to that potentiality, there's room for God. And what I mean by that is, I believe in an all-powerful and omniscient being. Obviously, I believe in one that the creator of the universe. You have every right, as a skeptic, to ask for that to be revealed to you. What you do with it after that is up to you. So in other words, I can only go so far as to ask God to show you. I cannot go so far as to, if it is compelling to you, make you go any further with it. And this is why I always tell people, it's like, I mentioned this in a discussion with a Baptist pastor, and he was asking, well, if I'm not in the church, then how would I experience it? I said, maybe you're experiencing it now because I am, so maybe this is your opportunity. I'm not saying that's the case with you. What I am saying, because in his case, he already claims to believe in Christ. So he has to follow the next steps in that sense, in that movement, and that is to join the church. But from the perspective of somebody who doesn't believe in God at all, I can only say that if you keep your mind and your heart open to Him, it's to be expected that He will show you in a way that is sufficiently compelling.
Provided that the deity in fact exists.
Yeah, well,
I mean that is
I'm arguing that
that is a pretty important caveat. Obviously,
yeah,
yes, I'm aware that you accept that caveat as being a factual statement about
sure,
reality,
but it's
and
not.
and I'm fine with that. Um, but as of right now, to me, it has not yet reached that point. Obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be an atheist.
Yeah.
Um, One person chimed in, someone named Nick Ross. I believe this may have been an answer to your question of what would it take to compel. And he states, pray in the name of Jesus and have limbs regrow, or if it wasn't Jesus, whatever God is real at that point.
Well,
Um,
it's
so okay, I would say that would be pretty compelling. But having not witnessed something like that, I honestly, if I'm going to maintain my level of intellectual honesty and consistency, it is that I cannot say for certain that that would be precisely what would compel me.
well, I mean, if that's all it took, all I have to go with you is the life of Saint John of Damascus, where when the emperor actually wanted him to stop writing, they chopped off his hand, and the next day, after fervent prayer before God, the Mother of God came and gave him a new one. So yes, that can happen, and I admit that within the realm of possibility, and that's when the emperor decided to let Saint John go and continue writing. So regrown limbs, and I hate to say this, and I hate to sound like a skeptic here, but regrown limbs have happened before. I just can also see them happening on God's command, but they can happen for other reasons as well. It's not
Right,
proper.
and here's why I would say that I'm not entirely sure that even that would be truly convincing or compelling for me. And this would be that, we do have evidence in the natural world of organisms, of animals that can be entirely dismembered and then completely regenerate. Like starfish, for instance. You can cut them up. It used to be the practice that they were seen as pests. And so they would take the starfish or the sea star, cut all the arms off, and then throw the chunks back into the ocean. Well, what happens at that point is every single one of those can regrow an entirely new organism. So at that point, all they've done is
Make more starfish.
Right, they've multiplied the population exponentially.
Well,
The same with other animals like the axolotl. They can regenerate lost limbs, and it's due to this natural phenomenon of they never fully advance out of the stage of their lives where their bodies stop producing stem cells, whereas we do. And so, if there were a way to say revert that in human beings,
well, that's what regenerative technology is all about. That with stem cells, that's
right? Exactly. And so again, that's why I say it's like that comment right there. While it is, I would say, on the right track, so to speak, I can't honestly say, yeah, that's what it would take for me.
Yeah, from my perspective as an Orthodox Christian, I can point to examples like I just did of that occurring, and we could come up with different explanations for it, but the one that's accepted by us is not doing it for a particular purpose. But the point is, so that does, but it's a great question though, because we're at least thinking outside our boxes. Because now we're
Right,
talking about
no,
chopped off hands. This is
I'm
good
all
stuff.
about that.
Yeah, this is where I feel most comfortable is when we're talking about the weird stuff.
Oh yeah, no, with me, bring on the weird. Because in all honesty, let me take this little banner down, talking about what's holding me back from orthodoxy. The tagline for my entire channel is "I'm searching for truth," not big T truth, not the big T philosophical truth that's put out or purported by, in large part, theists. I'm just searching for what is the most accurate description and representation of reality as it sits, as far from any form of bias as is attainable. I have no illusions that there's always going to be some kind of bias to some degree or other. I have no illusions of that, or delusions of grandeur on that part. But moreover, I do believe that based on how we've advanced as a species, how we've advanced as a society in the United States and in other countries abroad, is that we can, through continued concerted, consistent effort, get to a point where those biases become less and less intrusive and less influential on how we determine what our model of reality is.
Now, I would say, and this is, I hate to bring it back down to this like personal level, but I have to, because for me, the whole purpose of God, as you know, I think it was Saint Basil or Saint John Chrysostom who said, God became man so that man might become God. And what I mean by that is that we become united to Him. That's what He wants. And so ultimately, what I would say is this: if He wants you to become united to Him, when I converted to Orthodoxy, it was through an event. And after that event, before that, I was actually working in Catholic apologetics. Like, you know, I was a young guy, I was doing that. And literally, people told me that I had gone insane. Besides the whole "you're going to hell" stuff, the most common thing is you sound like a crazy person. But the reason was because the experience was so intensely personal that for me, it was absolutely self-evident. And for absolutely nobody else, it was self-evident. And so that taught me something in a sense. It didn't help me for Jack with apologetics. The methodology helped. But what it did teach me was that I can never recreate your experience with God.
Right.
And so
Dillahunty approaches it the same way, is that what convinces me may not convince you. What convinces you may not convince me.
Yeah.
So you know,
and
even
God,
if we could
an
entirely recreate your conversion experience, there's no indication whatsoever that event, that exact occurrence, down to the tiniest of atoms in regard to it,
I'll tell you what's
that would
really funny.
That would influence me over that.
Yeah, I like telling like the other, like what happened was I kept that story mostly a secret for a very long time, probably about 15 to 20 years before I started doing apologetics, and finally I wrote it down, and I mentioned it on one of my YouTube shows, and the response I got from a Roman Catholic was hilarious that I use it now, and he said, "Okay, so what you're saying is you had a stroke and you decided you weren't Catholic anymore." I'm like, "Okay, I literally not what happened, but you take it that way and it sounds good." So the point is that but that's, so now I say I had a stroke and decided I wasn't going to Catholic anymore, and it's just a lot easier than explaining the experience.
Okay.
But the point is your experience will be, just as I mentioned at the beginning of this, creating I believe, because it's absurd, is because your reality will be fundamentally altered when that happens.
Okay.
And at that moment, your connection with God may then exist, but it will not help another person at all. All you can do is try to, at that point, explain yourself, and God will work His way. We become united to God, but we don't become, omniscient and know what to do for everyone.
Right.
There's some things that are for us and some things that are for them.
Okay. It goes back to the whole essence and energies thing. To the extent of what is knowable and not knowable to us, what is attainable and not attainable for us, exactly, as far as unity with the deity at that point.
Yeah.
So I'm loving this discussion. I would love to kind of go longer with this, but I hate to say it, but we've gone for about an hour and 15 minutes at this point,
yeah.
And I do have to work tomorrow. So unfortunately, at some point, I've got to stop and go eat something and take care of some standard house chores before I go to bed.
Same. I understand completely.
That being said, Deacon Suaiden, I thoroughly enjoyed having you on today. I sincerely hope we can do this again in the future, and either
definitely
continue this discussion or go off on a completely different tangent. I don't know, maybe talk about Bigfoot. Who knows?
But how about the Mandela effect? No, I'm not even.
Okay, no, yeah, sure. We can talk about the Mandela effect.
All right.
We can get, and you know what? I'll even say, I'll even lift my earlier, not necessarily moratorium, but my suggestion in that we can talk a little bit about quantum stuff, quantum mechanics, and this, that, and the other. I'll study up on it as best I can, but there's a reason why not everyone is a quantum physicist,
Yeah,
because
obviously.
that crap is hard.
Yeah, absolutely.
So everyone be forewarned. That discussion will probably get incredibly weird and will probably be so thoroughly inadequate in explanation as
Well, as
to
long as we're moving past Aristotelian categories, I'm great.
yeah. So it will probably be a thoroughly, completely inadequate description of exactly how quantum physics is, what it does, and what it could be. But we're going to talk about it and we're going to have fun. So everybody join in and correct the crap out of us every time we get something wrong. I'm happy with that too. So, Deacon, did you want to say anything to kind of give a send off to the audience, even though there's nobody actually watching live right now?
That's okay. Hey, all I would say is if you want to check out our channel, you can like and subscribe here and enjoy. And Drew, it was great talking to you. Feel better. You know, hopefully we do this again soon.
All right, that sounds great. I couldn't have said it better myself. So again, my name is Drew. Joining me once again has been Deacon Joseph Suaiden of Orthodox Apologetics channel. I have linked their channel in the description down below. If you are interested, please feel free to click down there on the link, check it out, give them a like, give them a comment, give them a subscribe, and as always, like, comment, and subscribe on here. If you have anything to share with me, you can do so on Facebook in the ticker down below, facebook.com/The Atheist Reformation. And if you really want to talk to me as directly as possible, you can send me an email to the address right there on your screen right now, and I promise I will reply as swiftly as I possibly can. Until next time, I've been Drew of the Atheist Reformation. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Have a wonderful evening.